The interrogation room falls silent as Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Matthews places a photograph on the metal table. The image shows a young woman's lifeless body, discovered just hours earlier in a shallow grave behind a Manchester warehouse. Across from her sits Thomas Brennan, a 34-year-old estate agent who has just confessed to the murder. What happens next defies every expectation about guilt, remorse, and human psychology. Within minutes of his confession, Brennan begins embellishing his story, not to minimize his actions, but to make himself appear more clever, more calculating than he actually was. He describes elaborate planning that never existed, claims to have anticipated police tactics he clearly hadn't considered, and presents himself as a criminal mastermind rather than the opportunistic killer the evidence reveals him to be. This isn't unusual behavior for a certain type of offender. The data shows narcissists don't just lie differently than the rest of us, they experience guilt differently. In many cases, they don't experience it at all. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a forensic psychologist who has interviewed hundreds of violent offenders, explains that traditional interrogation techniques often fail spectacularly with narcissistic personalities. Where guilt-based questioning might break down a typical suspect, it often energizes the narcissist. They see interrogation not as punishment, but as an opportunity to perform. The neuroscience behind this behavior reveals something genuinely unsettling about how certain minds process consequences. Brain imaging studies suggest that individuals with narcissistic personality disorder show reduced activity in regions associated with empathy and moral reasoning. More critically, the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's alarm system for social and moral violations, appears to function differently in these individuals. Thomas Brennan's case exemplifies this neurological disconnect. 3 weeks after his arrest, whilst awaiting trial for murder, he contacted a local newspaper offering to sell his story. Not to express remorse or provide closure for the victim's family, but to ensure his side of events was properly represented. The timing reveals something crucial about narcissistic psychology. Most people caught in serious wrongdoing experience what psychologists call moral injury, a deep psychological wound that occurs when we violate our own ethical standards. This injury typically manifests as shame, guilt, and a desperate desire to make amends. But for individuals like Brennan, being caught doesn't trigger moral injury. It triggers narcissistic injury. The distinction is critical. Moral injury says, I have done something terrible and I must make it right. Narcissistic injury says, my superior self-image has been threatened and I must restore it. This explains why narcissistic offenders often become more grandiose after being caught, not less. They're not processing their crimes as moral failures requiring repentance, but as performance failures requiring better publicity. Recent research from the Institute of Psychiatry suggests this pattern extends far beyond violent crime. Financial fraudsters, corrupt politicians, and abusive corporate leaders often display identical psychological patterns when exposed. Rather than accepting responsibility, they launch media campaigns, write books, or give interviews designed to rehabilitate their image. The science here reveals something genuinely disturbing about human psychology. Approximately 75% of individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder show no measurable improvement in empathy or moral reasoning, even after years of therapy. This isn't a failure of treatment, it's a fundamental difference in how these minds process social and moral information. Where most of us experience guilt as an internal alarm system prompting behavioral change, They experience it as an external inconvenience requiring management. Thomas Brennan's trial became a masterclass in narcissistic performance. His defense team had advised him to show remorse, to acknowledge the victim's humanity, to demonstrate understanding of the pain he had caused. Instead, he used his testimony to correct what he saw as factual errors in the prosecution's case, and to emphasize his own intelligence and sophistication. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict him. But even conviction couldn't penetrate Brennan's psychological armor. Prison psychologists report that he spends his time writing what he calls his memoir, a detailed account of his crimes that portrays him as a misunderstood intellectual driven to violence by society's failure to recognize his superiority. He has approached multiple publishers, genuinely believing his story will be seen as compelling rather than repugnant. This pattern extends to how narcissistic offenders interact with other inmates and prison staff. Rather than accepting their position in the prison hierarchy, they often attempt to establish themselves as authorities on criminal justice, legal procedure, or prison reform. They write lengthy complaints about prison conditions, not from genuine concern for fellow inmates, but as evidence of their own analytical capabilities. The research suggests this behavior serves a crucial psychological function. For individuals whose core sense of self depends on perceived superiority, admitting genuine wrongdoing would require dismantling their entire identity structure. It's not simply that they choose not to feel guilt. Their minds have developed elaborate defense mechanisms that make genuine guilt psychologically impossible. They literally cannot process their actions as moral failures without experiencing what they perceive as psychological annihilation. This creates a particularly chilling reality for their victims and society at large. Unlike offenders who might eventually recognize their wrongdoing and change their behavior, narcissistic criminals often become more dangerous over time, not less. Each successful manipulation, each time they avoid full consequences, reinforces their belief in their own superiority and their right to victimize others. They don't learn from being caught. They learn from not being caught effectively enough. Thomas Brennan remains in prison, serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years. He continues to maintain his innocence despite his detailed confession, claiming police coercion and judicial bias. His victim's family reports receiving indirect messages through mutual acquaintances, not offering apologies, but requesting they set the record straight about his character. The implications extend far beyond individual cases like Brennan's. If we accept that certain minds are genuinely incapable of experiencing guilt and moral learning, what does this mean for how we structure justice, rehabilitation, and public safety? Perhaps the most unsettling question isn't why narcissists can't stop even when they're caught, but whether we've built our entire criminal justice system on the false assumption that everyone can.